Hi everyone, welcome to Tales of Dread. In part 5 of our Halloween special, we'll listen to the accounts of the park rangers. What have they encountered and what made them quit their job? Let's find out. But first, don't forget to like and subscribe. Here we go. Michael worked in the Ohio Pile as a park ranger. State Park in Pennsylvania had seen something that scared him and couldn't be explained. But before we get to today's stories, make sure you hit the like and subscribe buttons, so you can hear more stories about the mysterious and supernatural. Let's go. Someone who used to work as a park ranger sent in the first story. In the early 1990s, Michael worked as a park ranger in Ohio. He had worked there for about a year and a half and had also worked in the park office during that time. A park worker who had worked there for many years told him that he had had similar experiences in the late 1960s. He also met a man who said he had seen a Bigfoot in the park. He said he was riding his bike along a trail when he saw a Bigfoot. He said the creature was sitting by a stream with a deer on its lap. He said he stopped to watch it, and the creature noticed him. They looked at each other for a few moments before the creature stood up. He said it was at least 7 feet tall and had a very muscular build. He said that it started to move toward him, so he pedaled as fast as he could to get away. He said that the creature chased him for a short distance before stopping and running back to the stream. He says it was eating from a large tree limb that had been broken off where the deer's body was, and that it was tearing at the meat and bones with its hands. He said he watched it for a long time, and that it had been eating the deer and squirrels in the area, even though he hadn't seen any small animals in the area for a while. He watched it for a few more minutes. He said that the thing didn't seem to notice him or care about him. He rode away in the end. He said it was reddish-brown and covered with mud and leaves. It was also dirty and smelled bad, he said. But he saw his face clearly. He said the creature had a face that looked a lot like a human's, but its eyes were dark and didn't show any emotion. He also said that he realized later that the creature didn't seem to notice him, but was just eating. He was so scared that he didn't go back to the area for years. Michael has heard that Bigfoot has been seen in the area of the Laurel Highlands, but he has never seen one himself. He has heard a lot of stories about people seeing Bigfoot in Pennsylvania, but this is the only one that happened in Ohio Pile State Park. His co-worker had a very interesting thing happen to him while he was cleaning up a campsite. His co-worker says that while he was working alone, as the sun went down, everything started to get very quiet. At night, there was nothing at all. And he says he feels like someone is watching him. As he cleaned up the area, he said he could hear something moving through the thick brush behind him. When he turned around, there was a dead deer on the ground. At first, he thought it was a coyote, but as he got closer, he saw that it was a bigger animal. As it came out of the bushes, he could see that what he had thought was a coyote was much bigger than he had thought. This thing bent down, grabbed the dead deer, and threw it over its shoulder. The ranger said he was very scared and ran back to the ranger station. He didn't tell anyone, but I think that later that day, another ranger went to the area where he had been working and found all the bushes and tracks torn up. The other ranger who went there later said he didn't see anything, but the area made him feel very scared. This was also where the hiker saw what he was looking for. Could this mean that it was looking for food in this area? Michael wants to know if anyone else has seen the creature in the Laurel Highlands or the Ohio Pile State Park. The next story was sent in by a park ranger who thought he saw Bigfoot in the mid-1990s. He wanted to talk about what happened when he worked as a summer park ranger at the Ohio Pile State Park from 1992 to 1996. Ohiopyle is a beautiful state park in western Pennsylvania's Laurel Highlands. The thing that will be very interesting to the audience. He is talking about my audience because he was a ranger at the East Point picnic area from an office building during his first summer there. There was a short path you could take to get to the back entrance of the area, and another path that led to the creek about a quarter-mile away. Both trails were surrounded by barbed wire, so an animal could only get to them if it could go under a barbed wire fence. For about 4 years, he didn't see anything, even though there were rattlesnakes and springers north of the trail. Most of the time, they saw beavers and turtles, and every so often, they found dead white-tailed deer. In his second summer, strange things started happening more often. At night, he would hear a sound that sounded like a baby fender or didn't have much bass to it. It sounded like when you hit two cones together, but the pitch was much lower. He could sometimes hear prints coming from the south or the west. He started to see prints in the spring and fall. Large steps. The park rangers who worked in that park all year from the south half. Nobody knows about these. They started to hear whistling sounds coming from the woods. Sometimes it sounded like someone was calling their dog. Someone or something with strong lungs made the whistling sound. They hear it, and they hear a bird call that starts and stops suddenly. The whistling didn't sound like a bird, and they started to see what seemed to be the tops of small trees bend over and break off. Not just one or two, but many in different places at the same time. There were a lot of dead deer in the park, but this was different. They were not only finding dead deer, but also deer that had been killed and left to rot in the woods as an offering. They would find these deer in the strangest places. One time, they found one on top of a picnic table. Another time, they found one on the edge of a popular trail. Again, there was no reason for a dead deer to be the eyewitness, and the park ranger in question was then moved to the second year and became a ranger at the North Point picnic area. He then moved into a house trailer with 2 other rangers. On the first night there, they heard a sound that sounded like thunder, then whistling, then the call of a bird, and then it stopped. They heard something big moving through the woods several times. Then they heard something heavy being dragged across the ground. Then they heard something heavy being dropped and dragged again. This went on for a couple of hours. He talked about them as if they had killed an elk and were dragging it around, dropping it, and then dragging it again. Each time all 3 rangers heard it, the sounds got closer to the trailer and they could hear it moving all around. They turned on a big light and shined it out the back of the trailer, but there was nothing there. There were no drag marks in the ground, which they couldn't explain, but they could hear something big moving away. The next night, as soon as they turned on that light, they heard whistling and then a loud cracking sound like a tree being broken off. The next night, they were on the trail when they heard whistling and then saw something tall, brown, and skinny walking towards one of the park rangers. It was standing on 2 legs and seemed to have very long, skinny arms that were reaching out to them. No one could see its face because it was moving so fast. They tried to get a better look, but it was gone before anyone could really see it. Shortly after these events, in the 3rd year, the witness, who was also a park ranger, was moved and became a ranger at Creekside. This campground was beautiful, but at the time, there was no running water and the bathrooms were being fixed or remodeled. The first night they were there, the whistling started up again. It sounded like whatever it was now following this park ranger around, and then they would hear something crash through the woods. It was coming from a bigger, more densely wooded area on the other side of a big creek. The person who saw it wants to say that it was scary. They had a 12-gauge shotgun at the time, but they had to cross a wide, deep creek to get there. He never did, but his boss said he had crossed the creek and found nothing. The next night, the whistling started up again, and they heard a loud crap. Again, he went outside to find out what was going on. This time, the noise was coming from the south. There was a small trail that led into the woods, and even though his gut told him not to, he decided to follow it. As soon as he walks into the woods, he can hear something close by moving quickly toward him, and as he gets closer, he can hear it breathing heavily. He was shocked by what had happened. There was a loud sonic boom, like something heavy had hit a tree, and he could hear something being torn up from the ground and thrown. Bam, something hits the ground, but he can't see what it is without thinking. He goes back into hiding and won't answer any more calls about that trail or patrol after that. But he has heard some pretty crazy stories from better armed Rain who patrolled that area years ago, and they are very similar. Could that possibly be the home of Bigfoot or some other strange animal? Maybe even the eyewitness's park director, who was in charge of the park for a long time, had some pretty scary stories to tell. But most of all, they have come forward and said that this has been a big problem since the 1970s. So much so that the boss said they talked about shootings even though only a few of them had seen one. Even bigger guns were given to them by the government. After a problem with some campers at one of their other sites in the 1960s. The person who saw it was there for 3 years and heard the sounds of whistling, crashing through the woods, and silence in the woods. After that, they never went back to that part of the park. He said the whistling was almost high-pitched, but it had a deep pitch or timbre to it. It sounded like what a Bigfoot or something else that was very big and had big lungs would sound like. The crashing sounded like a bulldozer or something moving through the woods. The tree or a big branch would be broken off like a stick, and whatever was in it would be thrown. He wasn't sure, but he thinks it was a small fir tree being pulled out of the ground and thrown. He doesn't know how else to explain the loud crash that scared him. The main person who saw this happen says they aren't scared of anything, but this scared them. All of the other park rangers he has talked to have told him similar things, and the one who actually saw it says it was about 8 feet tall. He isn't sure about that, but he knows for sure that what he saw wasn't a person. Our last story in today's video is about a strange series of events that are almost too strange to explain. Let's hear what happened. In 1998, this listener worked with another park ranger at Ohio Pyle State Park. He wanted to write in and talk about what he did there. They wanted to say a few words about them. They had been in the Army for 4 years, and a former police officer was a park ranger at Ohio Pyle State Park until he retired in 1998. Rangers often have to work on holidays, especially around the 4th of July and Labor Day. So, on the Labor Day weekend of 1998, he worked with another ranger named Peter. During their shifts, they kept an eye on the trailheads. They both saw a man dressed in all black walk down the path. He had on this robe that almost looked like a hood. You couldn't see the man's face, but you could tell he was walking down the trail toward the two rangers. They both saw this man walking on the trail, and the ranger was patrolling one of the trailheads at a higher elevation. While his co-worker was patrolling the trailhead closest to Dorman's land, Peter radioed him and asked if he could see the man and how strange he was. He was acting strange and doing strange things. It looked very strange. Something about him just seemed wrong and very strange. As they watched this man walk down the trail, it made both rangers feel bad. Through one of the patrol zones, they noticed that there was something very strange about him. He just stopped showing up. When he walked into the woods, he almost seemed to disappear. The radios of the eyewitness. When Peter went back to ask if he could still see the man, he said that the man had already left. They couldn't figure out how this person could have walked down the trail and then vanished. Even though they were on patrol for a long time, they never saw this man again or found out where he went. We had nowhere else to go. He had to be seen at least a little bit, if not by park rangers then by other hikers. This kind of scared them, but there wasn't much they could do about it. So they let it go, and the next day they were both back at work, this time on one of the other trailheads on the other side. The main person who saw what happened was driving back to the station when Peter radioed him, and told him to get out of his truck and come here right away. He said that a woman was coming down from Dorman's Landing. This happened around 10 AM on a busy holiday weekend. He told him to wait a few minutes and he'd be there as soon as possible. The witness remembers driving back to the trailhead and getting out of his truck. As he walked down to the trailhead, he could see a woman walking, and she looked very upset. He could tell she was very upset about something. She couldn't help but look behind her. She was nervous as she walked down the trail. So, the eyewitness asks Peter if he remembers seeing this woman. Peter says he doesn't, so it seems like she just showed up out of nowhere. Both of them try to talk to the girl and ask her if she's all right. She didn't answer, though. She didn't care about either of them and just kept going until she just disappeared in front of them. They were both very confused by this event, but neither of them knew how to explain it. They never saw this woman again. The next day, which was the third day they both worked at the same trailhead, it was the same shifts and patrols as the first day they both worked there. The eyewitness was working on the first when Peter radioed him again to say that there were now two men walking down the trail wearing all black, just like on day one. Peter and the eyewitness moved, so they could see these two men, and they made a disturbing discovery. Both of these men were dressed in all black and wore something that looked like a hood. They can't see anything that looks like a face. I mean, it's just blank, there's nothing there, and all you can see is skin, so whoever it is has no face at all. And he starts to ask him, "Do you see what I see?" Peter is speechless and doesn't know what to say because these people don't have faces. And just like the other two, they just disappear. Long story short, Peter and the witness have no idea how to explain any of this because it was all so strange. He worked there for a few years after this, but I never saw anything like what he had just seen in Ohio Pyle State Park other than his own Twilight Zone episode. That's about as strange as it gets, and he says that after all these years, it still scares him. But what do you think is more important? Don't forget to tell me what you think in the comment. The terrifying account that we will hear is about a park ranger who was standing watch atop the fire tower when he came face to face with something that was absolutely awful, because it was unnatural. Keep an eye out. You are going to not want to pass up this opportunity. If this is your first time visiting the channel, we ask that you kindly consider subscribing, clicking on the bell, giving the video a big thumbs up, and recommending it to a friend. Now let's get it into the story section. Being in charge of the fire lookout is not necessarily a challenging job, but there is a certain level of pressure that comes along with it. Fires are difficult to put out, and to tell you the truth, by the time I've reported one, I already feel like I've accomplished very little. This idea came to me while the most recent storm cell was moving in, and I was pulling up a chair to watch. Lightning is the leading cause of fires in our area, so whenever I see a bolt of lightning, I look to see whether it starts a fire. I even have a short checklist with items that need to be reported back on. A short checklist is the one activity that makes me feel the most incompetent. While the situation rages out of control someplace below me, I am sitting comfortably in my tiny watch house and reporting on the color of the smoke. Do we have white smoke, or do we have gray smoke? Being protected by the clouds makes the presence of the black smoke irrelevant to me. I rolled my eyes and then sat back down to continue watching the storm as it raged on outside my windows while feeling as bored as I did inside. I kept staring at what was going on. I will freely acknowledge that it's possible I had become complacent. Indeed, this location is rather remote. However, one may summon a helicopter with a phone call. In the event that I felt the need to escape, I knew I could find solace in being by myself in this forest, surrounded by clouds and trees. It did not occur to me that maybe I did not have enough time, since I failed to take into account the fact that it would take the helicopter some time to come to me, and it also did not occur to me that perhaps I was running out of time. The sound of someone knocking on my door could hardly be made out over the roaring of the wind outside. It is impossible for me to overstate how little companionship you receive while you work as a fire lookout. There are things like food drops, but nobody, and I repeat nobody, will be knocking on your door to offer assistance. It is quite difficult to trek up here, and there is no sign of human habitation elsewhere in the immediate area. It is very improbable that somebody will really be knocking on my door at this very moment. I glanced at the door as I was looking out the window, and it seemed as if I was aware that I had selected that particular time to look. There was another knock on the door. The lightning picked that moment to hit considerably closer, and the brightness that resulted illuminated my chamber. Whoever was standing outside my door at the time, regardless of whether they were intended to be there or not, must be terrified out of their wits. So I went ahead and opened the door. In retrospect, I am well aware that it was an absolutely dumb thing to do, but at this time, I still had some semblance of a human heart. I opened the door to see a little finger standing there, covered in a dark rain slicker. As I was still taken aback by its appearance, I did not give a greeting, and it did not offer one either. The thing in question has just entered the room without uttering a sound. "Hey dude, are you okay?" I couldn't help myself and had to ask, "How the heck did you ever get up here?" It retorted that there is a fire in the building. It was facing me with its back. "There's a big one out there. I came to give you a warning." I turned my head to look out the window, and noticed the identical cloud of smoke that I had described earlier in my report. Before making the call, we waited until the storm cell had moved on, as is customary operating practice. That's right, I did see that one. "Are you okay? Have you found yourself unable to escape it?" I inquired, apprehensive that he had not yet revealed his appearance to me. "What plans do you have to address this matter? Are there people living in that area?" The voice that replied me was more angry. "Isn't this the reason you came in the first place? Isn't this why you've come all the way out here today? It is finished." In a sense, he was correct. What exactly was the purpose of producing reports and keeping a track of the location and length of time? Even if there was anything natural that I could do about it, it was pointless. "Sincerity demands that you accompany me." He murmured that we are in need of assistance, and you have come to assist us. It was as if I had just stepped into the first scene of my own superhero movie. I would dash into the forest, despite the howling winds that were all around me, and I would lead these hapless hikers to safety. They would make up stories about me and publish them. There might probably even be children who were named after me. I wouldn't just be a bystander watching. I'd be a savior. The lightning struck again, illuminating the room completely. I choked and accidentally dropped the hiking boots in the process. I had just grabbed. When I was thinking about how heroic I was, the person had turned around to look at me at some point. The black slicker had covered most of its body, but the lightning had lighted up its deformed face, causing burnt portions of its face to fall like ash at its feet and apparently vanish. What the hell? Dude? I shouted, springing back. Immediately, I had a feeling of embarrassment. They taught us on burn victims, and I pretended to be a citizen who had never seen a burn victim before despite the fact that we had been trained on burn victims. I instantly rectified the situation by stating that I was on the phone with someone. Don't worry about it, everything will be okay. It growled at me as it approached me and moved closer. It won't work out all right. It let forth a snarl. You have no choice but to accompany me. You will need to provide a hand. I have no idea why my training began to take effect at this particular time, but all of a sudden the procedures that they had repeatedly driven into my head began to take effect simultaneously. When I was staring at the extent of his wounds, the thought came to me how particularly idiotic it would be to rush into the burning force with someone who was gravely hurt while I was seeing the severity of his burns. After what seemed like hours but was really just seconds, he had escaped the building alive, which was a miracle in and of itself. The receptionist at my workplace answered the call. I have someone with them out here, I said while holding my breath. You are in contact with another person, the dispatcher remarked while expressing disbelief. He has, in fact, been singed. It's not good. He claims that there is more to discover farther down the mountain. We need assistance. Listen to me. The dispatcher instructed him to lower his voice. Now, under no circumstances should you leave. Do not speak to him. Avoid making eye contact with him and act as if he is not there. Do you comprehend me? What? It is not a male person. The door had been locked, and I was alone myself inside. I ran out the door in a hurry to see if I could find him and bring him back. There's no way he could have made it very far with those injuries. I had a feeling that it would be practically hard to see anything through the storm, but just as I was about to give up hope, I saw his movement near the forest line. Only stood there with 5 fingers that were slowly burning. They were surrounded by a cloud of white smoke, yet they did not move an inch as their fingers, hands, limbs, legs, and everything else turned to ash. They had sent a chopper to come to my location the next day, and according to what they told me, I was still wailing when they arrived. To tell you the truth, my office had indicated that it wasn't anything personal, but they had determined that I was not a good match for the position, and they let me go with a very large severance payout. The fact that I was fired didn't bother me all that much. Nobody had cared to explain anything to me about what had taken place up on that mountain, and I was left in the dark about it. And to tell you the truth, I'm not even sure whether I wanted to find out. Because of this, I'm a little taken aback by the fact that I felt the want to inquire of them, why. At the conclusion of our conversation about my alleged retirement, the gentleman in front of me gave a little shake of the head while also shuffling a few pieces of paper. We need individuals who will not respond to the beckoning of the mountain. He volunteered to take me home each week and stood to see me leave. I'm going to assume that the narrative we heard tonight was entertaining for you guys. It gives me the creeps just thinking about it. Who knows if it is some sort of apparition ghost, the spirit of someone who perished in the fire in the past, or some kind of force demon that is attempting to gather souls. Leave a comment below telling me what you believe it was, and if you were watching anything when you were out in the middle of nowhere in the woods, let me know. I'm not sure what to call this thing. I don't even know what to think about all of this. It's almost paradoxical. I'm a jumbled mess when I don't have a drink in my hand, but the alcohol calms my mind enough that I can put together the right words to say what I need to say. Before I went back to drinking, I had been sober for almost 10 years. Now, the bottle is the only thing that keeps me from going crazy. What used to be my biggest problem is now the only thing that gives me the strength to get through this, no matter what happens. At the very least, I can say I did everything I could to stop more accidents and deaths. If you're reading this, I'm sure you've already called the police after seeing what looks like the set of a slasher movie from the 1980s. What I know for sure will be pieces of flesh all over the cabin is my ID. Will almost certainly be nearly impossible because there won't be much left to find. So, yes, Alex Sherman's blood and guts are all that's left of him. He was the park ranger for these woods for about 20 years. I spent my whole life protecting and preserving the woods, becoming one with nature and making sure that all the families and explorers were safe and always made it back home. Even though I know now that I can't help anyone, I can't help myself. Let me start from the beginning so that you, whoever finds this, can figure out what's going on and figure out how to stop it. But first, let me get another drink. I don't have much time, so I want to get as much as I can while I can. My dad grew up in a family that didn't have a lot of money or resources, so he had to learn to be on his own. He made a name for himself and worked his way up the corporate ladder until he was making enough money to give his family a safe and loving home. My father liked to live through my brother and me. He would always tell us stories about how, when he was a kid, he would watch other kids take karate classes, music lessons, and join the Boy Scouts. So you figured it out? When dear old dad put us in these classes and pushed us to do well in them, we became like his projects. I never really cared much about karate in music, but being out in nature made me feel like a Boy Scout, and I liked that right away. The clean air, catching fish, and cooking them on our own was the most rewarding and fulfilling thing about any scout group trip. You knew I'd be eagerly waiting at the crack of dawn, with my bags packed and ready to go on whatever trip was planned. Georgie, who was 3 years younger than me, didn't like being outside like I did. He had the amazing gift of being able to pick up any musical instrument and learn how to play it so quickly that it seemed impossible. From the time he was 10 years old. When I first joined the Boy Scouts, I became more and more sure that I could not only survive, but also thrive in the great outdoors. By the time I was 16, all I could think about was the Boy Scouts. School was just a small part of life that I had to go through. The good thing, because there's always a silver lining, is that I get to walk home from school because I decided not to do anything after school. I got to be in the world I loved so much. And every day on my way home was the first time I saw a truly wild part of nature. On one of these crazy walks home, I was about to turn 17 and we lived in a small town. Most of the architecture was made up of old colonial buildings. I guess people don't have the money to develop the land much more or just don't see the point in doing so. The lack of progress gave the impression that our lovely little town was almost stuck in time. Nature was left alone and grew on its own. People in our town didn't see any reason to cut down trees or keep the beautiful woods and forests that were there. Even though I love how easy it is to get into the woods and wander deeper into nature, the thickets of the forest were really beautiful. Because there were so many trees, it was almost impossible to tell the difference between day and night. It seemed like a separate world. I found it by accident when I went deep into the forest. Near the path I would walk on, there was a deer head in a pool of blood. I knew about the food chain and that animals do, in fact, eat one another. But this didn't feel the same. 6 years in the Boy Scouts taught me a lot about wildlife, but seeing a deer's head ripped off seemed strange. If it was to be eaten, it seemed like a kill for the main purpose of mutilating the animal, which bothered me. I kept going along the path. I felt a strange sense of courage because I thought I knew enough to avoid or stop being attacked myself. I found another one a little farther down the path. The deer had one of its legs torn off, leaving a string of tendons visible. Its intestines and other body parts were lying next to it. Whatever had killed. As the deer moved down the path, it looked like it was dropping pieces of it. I had never smelled blood and death before, and I quickly lost my courage when I threw up my lunch in the bushes. With so few carnivores hiding in the forest, it didn't seem like they could cut up animals. Who would be so disgusting as to rip another animal apart and put the pieces all over for a horrible show? Soon, I knew the answer when a strange sound broke through the quiet chirping and buzzing of the forest. It sounded like every tortured soul in hell screamed at the same time. The volume and intensity of the scream made it possible to figure out how close or far away the sound came from. My knees gave out and my blood froze. I felt wet as soon as I realized that the blood from the killed deer had run all the way down the path to where I had just thrown up and then passed out. The screams started up again, and this time I could almost feel the sound, whatever it was. Everyone else in the forest seemed to stop moving when they heard the screams. After the screams stopped, all I could hear was my heart beating very fast. A branch broke behind me, which made me jump up and turn around. When I tried to fight or run away, I broke more branches. I was still. From the direction where the branches broke, a low growl, grunt, and snarl were heard. Then it was quiet. I stood there, not sure if I should run or act like I was dead, and hoped that the smell of my blood would make them think it was theirs. My ears rang, and I felt like I couldn't hear anything. An explosion from a gunshot shook the forest, and I started crying because I was scared and confused. Another shot was fired from somewhere I couldn't see, but I could see tree bark flying where the projectiles had broken through the thicket of trees. I lost track of how many shots were fired, but the sound of snapping branches made it clear that whatever was in the woods was now moving away from me. Instead of coming up to me from where the snarls were, I was pulled up and saw him through my tears. The park ranger stood in front of me with his rifle slung over his shoulder. As I gathered myself, he quickly pulled me back over the deer head and along the path to the cabin, which was slightly off the path where he was based. After making sure I wasn't hurt, he poured 2 full cups of whiskey and drank his in one gulp. He then poured a second cup and waved for me to join him. Even though the whiskey burned as I drank it, the warmth it gave me made me feel a little bit better. By the time I finished my first cup, the ranger had already drunk about 4. I asked for another and tried to drink it in the same way. He didn't believe any of it. I thought I was dreaming as the ranger told me what little he knew about the creature. His name tag said Joel, and he showed me a scrapbook full of drawings and Polaroid pictures as he talked about how many animals had been cut up. The monsters that Joel drew scared me. After I first saw them, I dreamed about them for years. The red eyes he painted were so well done that they seemed to move. On the pages were Polaroids of many, many animals that had been torn apart. Guts and intestines were draped over tree branches and across forest paths, and heads with dead eyes were lying in the forest like rocks or logs. He told me that the dates on the photos showed that whatever this was, it seemed to live and work in a cycle. He had been a park ranger for 30 years. In that time, the creature had gone through 3 cycles. He didn't know where it came from or where it went, but it showed up every 10 years like clockwork. He didn't know what it was weak against, but high-caliber bullets seemed to hurt it at least. He said he tried to tell the police and other nearby authorities, but they laughed at the idea that a red-eyed demon had killed animals. He knew I would believe him because I'd heard it before. He could tell by the look on my face that I would never forget it. He told me that based on what he had seen, the cycle was coming to an end, but he would walk me home and keep watching the woods until he was sure. For now, He didn't seem to care if I tried to tell people what had happened or not. He had tried for 30 years and was fighting this on his own, so it was clear that being believed didn't matter to him at all. His age was obvious, and the horrors he had seen while fighting on his own for so long had made it worse. The next year, when I turned 18, I finished school and applied to be a park ranger. I knew I had 9 years to learn as much as I could from Joel to be ready to take over and protect the town from whatever this thing was. I hoped that the two of us could do together what Joel had been trying to do on his own for decades. Joel did everything he could to stop me from joining his fight. It was almost as if he knew it was an impossible battle with no chance of winning. When he saw that I was determined to help him, he let me into the cabin and gave me a Remington 700 rifle and a bottle of Jack Daniels. According to Joel, these are 2 things you need to survive and stay sane in the forest alone. It takes all of my self-control and willpower not to tell them that no beautiful sights can make up for the sight of a rotting, half-eaten body, teenager. I can't go back to my old job, not because I don't want to. When I'm driving home from work and I see a damn tree, I start to cry. Since that search happened in the last month of my job, I can't even bring myself to look at pictures of the forest. It all started on a warm, quiet summer day, the 1st of August, when my partner, Holly, and I were doing general maintenance on well-worn trails. Suddenly, we heard hurried footsteps, frantic panting, and cries for help. When we turned quickly to face the source of the sound, we saw a clearly upset woman running towards us, shouting and waving her arms. We yelled back at her to get her attention, but she didn't stop. She didn't stop until she ran into me headfirst, still crying and begging for help. My son is no longer with me. He went away. He's gone. Help me, small black square, she screamed right in front of me. Her face was red, and mascara and tears had mixed together and spread all over it. I tried to make her feel better, but she wouldn't listen. That poor mother kept going on and on and on. I don't know if I would have been able to calm her down if Holly hadn't been there. Holly took her away from me, made her sit down, and made her drink some water. It took her about 5 minutes to calm down enough to make sentences that made sense. It's okay. Give us the details. He will be found. We always do. Holly put her hand on the woman's shoulder and said, "He can't be far away, Mom." I've always wished I had a voice like hers. I had seen her talk to 2 drunk men and stop a fight between them. We used to joke that she was really a fool in disguise. We were walking and Chester was right behind me. I could see it from my back. She showed us a picture on her phone of the smaller boy with blonde hair smiling and holding a cat. My phone rang, so I looked down at my purse and let go of his hand to get my phone. When I looked back up, he was gone. She began whistling again. I looked down for a short time. "What do you mean when you say gone?" I said something. The damn kid couldn't have vanished without a trace. I was thinking to myself. It was as if a strong gust of wind had flown by and grabbed him. I felt something, and he wasn't there a second ago, she said as she sobbed over and over again. "Don't be afraid, miss. He probably liked what he saw off the path, so he went into the forest. Don't worry, it happens all the time. We'll find him," Holly told her as we let her out of the park and into the lobby. We gave her some tea to calm her down, but then decided not to wait any longer. Called for a search. We gave the picture she had shown us to all the active rangers and then joined the search. We went into the forest and walked the whole length of the path where the boy was said to have gone missing. We didn't say anything and kept our eyes open for any clues about what might have happened to the boy. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, so we went back to the place she told us about. She stopped where a big oak tree was. Now you can see that the path I was talking about is very narrow and is surrounded on both sides by trees that go for miles into the park. Still, it's close to the park's entrance, so we were pretty sure we'd find the boy before he got too far away. We were searching with a few other experienced rangers, but Holly and I decided to split up so we could cover more ground. I stepped off the trail and started looking around slowly and carefully. After walking for about half an hour, I had nothing to show for it. I talked to Holly and some other rangers, hoping they might have good news, even though I knew that if they did, they would have already told me. My worst fears came true. The boy was nowhere to be found. Small black square, small black square, small black square, small black square. I remember thinking that this was going to be a big problem that the police would have to deal with. I was about to turn around and walk back when I noticed something strange in the knee-high grass. It was a small red dot, almost too small to see. Probably the only reason I saw it was because of that. It made a big difference and turned the space between the trees into a sea of green. I walked slowly toward a small, red, rectangular shape that was lying on the grass. It said baseball legends in big letters. I turned it around to see a smiling black man with no hair. Under the picture, it was clear, the name Barry Bonds was written. This was a baseball card, and it looked like it had never been used. It didn't have any creases or other damage that a piece of paper could get from moving around in the wild and being blown around by the wind. After telling other people about what I had found, I decided to dig deeper and keep looking. When the dust started to settle, I couldn't find out any more. I went back to the lobby and met up with the other people. They had even less luck than I did, which is sad. The baseball card I found was there before me, so I took it to the mother, who was sad. I almost wish I hadn't opened the car door. Her eyes were wide and seemed dry. She figured out that the tears were Chester's because he never left the house without them. She said that he likes to carry them in a breast pocket of his vest. "Where on the grass did you find it?" I replied that I didn't know what else to do, and before the mother could start crying again, Holly stopped her with a suggestion that would calm her down. Even though it's just one card, it's likely that it fell out of his pocket while he was walking. "No, you don't understand?" the woman yelled. "He watches over them like valuables. He always keeps the pocket closed and checks to make sure they are safe. He went with someone. He went with someone." She screamed, "Someone took him away from me." This time, she didn't have a console with her, so Holly drove her home and told her she would keep her up to date on our search. We thought this would be an easy search, but it wasn't. So the police didn't get involved right away. But now, the bad, serious side of this disappearance was starting to show. Holly was about to park her Jeep when the police showed up. After taking the mother home, we continued the search overnight with their help. We didn't find anything that night, and we didn't find anything for the next 26 days and nights, either. All of the working rangers put their regular jobs aside to help with this search. We all worked together with the police and the many volunteers. But every day brought more bad news. Every day, Holly and I would go further and further into the woods with a search dog. We didn't find anything, though. The dogs didn't pick up any scent, and neither did the air searches or the forest searches. It was like, "Stop being little Chester." His mother didn't stay at home like we told her to. Instead, she waited at the edge of the forest until late at night, when we would come back to give her more bad news. She wanted to go out and look for him herself, but we couldn't let her. She was already a mess, so we had to leave an employee at the front desk with her so she wouldn't hurt herself. Every time I saw her, my heart hurt more and more, because every time I saw her, I couldn't give her anything but more disappointment. Holly acted like she didn't care, but her eyes said more than words could about how much she was hurting. The 27th of August was when we finally found what was left of Chester. Because of this whole thing, I can't sleep unless the lights are on and I take a lot of pills. This is why I still wake up screaming every night, remembering how awful those times were. Holly and I had been looking all day, and as night fell, we decided on a whim that we shouldn't go back or rest, but should hurry. We were in the middle of a forest, and the trees and branches were getting closer together. Every step we took. Our search dog was already an old dog who was getting ready to retire. Still, he was one of the sharpest dogs we had. We had a long history of finding teenagers who had gotten drunk and wandered off the path, so we were sure that if we missed anything, he would find it. It was around 2 in the morning. When we came to a clearing with a small hill in the middle, I recognized it from a map I had looked at earlier. Holly and I both had to hear me say that I had never been here before. We walked over to the hill and rested our backs on it, taking deep breaths and enjoying this moment of calm. Suddenly, Gesture stood up and violently sniffed the air around him. Then, he started barking like crazy. We got up and used our flashlights to look around, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. We then looked more closely at Gesture, who was still acting crazy. The jester was barking at the bound. We decided to go for a walk and find out what was upsetting them. I set him free, and he ran to the other side of the hill. Holly and I crossed it and met up with him. Now that he was dead quiet and fixed on one spot, Holly and I shined our flashlights in the direction that Gesture was pointing. I noticed right away that there was something strange about the spot where grass was growing and thriving all over the mound. Here it seemed like it was, small black square, stuffed. I grabbed a handful of grass and pulled it back, revealing a hard wooden surface underneath. Holly and I quickly started pulling out the grass to get to whatever was hiding behind it. Our efforts weren't in vain. It was a dry, heavy log standing straight up and blocking the way. The sun could be seen in the places where the log didn't cover it up. We found out that there was definitely some kind of room in there. In retrospect, a bad smell came from that room. We should have figured it out. Holly asked, "Should we go inside?" with one hand over her nose and the other on her hip. I wish I had been more hungry that day. We should have called for help. I wish we had never seen that stupid hill. "Yes, please help me pull this out," I said, telling Jester to move back and wait. He listened. We both grabbed the log and pulled it back, which showed us a way in. I will always be sorry that I turned on my flashlight inside and saw a pile of dry, dirty bones. A small, weak body was there. Maggots were already living inside of him. He was missing skin on his arms, legs, and face, but what scared me the most was that his rib cage had been ripped open with brute force and was still fresh. Trails of blood were all over the dirt floor. I couldn't take the sight any longer, so my arms moved the flashlight up on their own. When I moved quickly, I saw 3 pairs of bloody, dirty feet. Molly was breathing shallowly behind me, and I could hear it almost against my will. I pointed the flashlight up and screamed in horror at the horrible thing I saw. The jester's menacing growls filled the screaming silence around us, holding us captive with these things. 3 of them were there. They were naked and covered in blood from the tips of their long fingernails to the rest of their rotting teeth. Their unsettling smiles, which almost showed pride in what they had done, showed their teeth. All 3 of them growled at the same time. They made a terrible, raspy sound. I worry that will always be in my head. As fast as lightning, they stood up and charged at me. Jester ran up and grabbed the closest one by the leg. I pulled out my gun anyway. I only got one shot into the thing's stomach, but it was a good one. Jester attacked me before they got too strong and I lost my mind. It was Holly that kept me alive. I'd rather find out when she and my other co-workers came to see me in the hospital. When those things tried to eat me at that moment, Holly threw a full magazine and then another one for good measure. But she couldn't be a consultant because she accidentally killed a man who jumped up to grab the neck of one of the monsters. So, now you know why I stopped working as a park ranger. That's why I cry when I see a tree. When I heard that Chester's mother had killed herself, my heart broke into a million pieces. But do you know when I actually cried the hardest? This morning while I was watching the news on TV and drinking my coffee, I screamed at the TV and threw the remote with all my might, shattering the display when the freaking news anchor had reported a teenage girl who had went missing in the national park. I'm not going to sign this because I don't want to lose my job. I work as a park ranger near Clemson, South Carolina. I'm only sending this to you because I think everyone should know what's out there. In this area, which we call the Mountain Bridge Wilderness, there are a number of parks. It has the state parks of Tables, Rock, Caesars, Head, and Jones Gap. I'm not going to tell you which one this happened in, but they're all pretty close. In all of them, I think people should be careful. First of all, I wasn't the only one to see this. I was on this trail because another hiker said he or she had seen something strange. He was pretty scared, but he didn't say much. We all thought it was some kind of joke. So, I had to walk 6 miles on a trail that ends at a waterfall to find out what was going on. This hike is pretty hard and not taken by many people. Honestly, this area has so many waterfalls. People seem to like going to the ones that are easy to get to and end in a shallow pool where their kids can swim. This waterfall is pretty, but it isn't very big or well known. I was excited about the project. I'm not the type to hang out at the ranger's office or walk around campsites to make sure no one is breaking the rules. I usually volunteer for jobs that take me deeper into the woods, like fixing trails and other things. So, I was walking along this very steep part of the trail before I got to the falls when some rocks started to slide. It wasn't a big rock slide disaster, just a bunch of smaller rocks and debris falling from the trail above me. We saw a lot of deer and a few black bears here, and this kind of thing is usually caused by a big animal up ahead. So I thought it could be a bear. I moved slowly and carefully. When I got to the top, I took a look around before heading west toward the falls. Not many people come up here. So it didn't surprise me that the place was empty. I was ready to stop working. So when I got to the falls, I found a nice flat rock in the shade and sat down with my water bottle, thinking I deserved a break. After that, I was going to check out the area, and then go back down. I was just sitting there thinking about my day when I heard something crash through the bushes on the other side of the falls. Back there are a lot of trees. I stayed still and quiet because I thought that some wildlife would come to drink. Someone or something was coming to drink. But it was different from anything else I'd ever seen. I kid you not. This thing almost looked like a dead deer that had started to rot. Its head was just bone, a skull with empty eye sockets, but it was alive and moving. Plus, it was very big. I know that most people would think I was crazy, but I've heard you tell a few stories on this site, so I can tell you that this thing was dead, and somehow alive. You could smell the rotting flesh on its body, and here and there on its neck, you could see bones. It looked like it was going to drink, and I'm sitting on the other side of the river, too scared to even breathe. I could only think, this can't be true. It then saw me. It lifted its head and pointed straight at me with its empty eye sockets. All of a sudden, the red inside of its head lit up like coals on a campfire. I was really scared because I knew this thing was evil. I got up and started running, but then I heard a loud splash. I turned around, but I was afraid that the thing had jumped into the shallow water and was coming after me. I ran down that trail so fast that I crashed into trees and cut my face on the loose rocks as I tried to keep my balance. I was lucky not to fall off the mountain and hurt myself badly. I stopped and listened when I was about 1.5 miles away. Nothing was going on behind me. I can't say what it was, but I can tell you what I saw. Maybe it was a bad spirit, even though you couldn't see through it, or maybe there are creatures out there that we never see because they're so good at hiding. I don't know if it meant to hurt me, either. Was it going after me? Seemed like it. But who's to say that it didn't have an air of, I guess you'd call it evil. I'm sure I don't want to see it again. I didn't tell anyone. Maybe that sounds weak, but I don't want to lose my job or be told I need to see a therapist because of this. I do think people should be careful when they go into the woods, no matter where they are, but especially in that part of South Carolina. Out there, there's danger. Danger can come in ways you don't expect, so stay safe and don't hike alone. When those really bad wildfires hit Northern California, I was a volunteer firefighter. I'm from Idaho, but because the fire was so out of control, they flew me and some of my friends down there to help. All of those homes and neighborhoods were destroyed in a way I couldn't even imagine. It made me feel very sad. They made us camp far away from any fires, and every night someone was on watch and radio. We were always on high alert because a change in the wind could cause miles to burn in minutes. I had been there for a week or maybe a week and a half. We had just worked 15 or 16 hours, and dinner was almost done. So it must be around 11 or 12 at night. Casey runs up to us and tells us to follow him to the back of the camp. That group had maybe 25 or 30 tents, so back of camp is a bit of a stretch. We went with him until we got to these train tracks. He was yelling about a strange sound he heard while he was going to the bathroom. I and everyone else couldn't hear anything. Casey was never this way. He was very calm and never made a big deal out of anything. I think he was an English teacher or something at one point, but I didn't know him very well because I had only worked with him once before he ran down the train tracks. Even though it was getting dark, you could still sort of see what was going on because of the fires. There was a general sense of happiness. Casey was a long way ahead of us, and we lost him in a group of trees up ahead. About then, the wind decided to change, and the fire moved quickly toward us. But you see, the fire got their way too quickly. The distance it traveled should have taken at least an hour. But all of a sudden, everything went up in flames. Even the wood of the railroad tracks and the trees and grass. I could also see that the metal of the train tracks was on fire. Nothing about this made sense. Too much was going on too quickly. We were surrounded by walls of fire on all sides, and they were getting closer. When I looked up, I saw that the flames were also above us. At first, I thought I was making it up. Nancy, then. One of the other women on the team began to yell over the noise of the fire. Are you listening? It sounded like a strange mix of a hiss and a hum. It was low and high at the same time, and I could feel it in my bones. The fire got brighter where Casey had gone, and when I realized the hissing was coming from below, the ground started to shake. A huge fireball-like thing went up in front of us. Around us, the fire died down, but in front of us, it got even brighter, and I thought I saw the shape of a person deep in the flames. I thought it was Casey, but as I got closer, it was hard to tell, but I think it was between 7 to 8 feet tall. No one could have stood up to that heat, either. It was impossible. The shrieking and humming got louder, and I saw that the creature was running toward us. Its front legs were long and swinging until it got closer, at which point I felt like it was reaching. I jumped out of the way of where the fire was going. It might have been where the fire started. Just before I lost consciousness, I rolled over and saw its legs, which looked like the back legs of an animal, like a horse or a goat. I woke up and didn't know how long I had been out, but it must have been a while because it was getting light outside and not just because of the nearby wildfires. As the sun rose, I could see that I wasn't the only one who had passed out. Nancy and some of the guys were also lying on the ground nearby. I checked on them all while they were still out but still alive and breathing. I looked around and saw a huge hole where the railroad track had been. Some of the metal had melted and dripped down the side of the hole, making it look like icicles. I went to the edge of the hole, which was more like a pit and was probably at least 10 or 15 feet deep. It was covered in ash on the sides. When I turned around, I saw that nothing had been burned. The track had melted a little, and a few feet on either side of the pit were a little burned, but everything else was green grass and weeds that hadn't been burned. The trees still had their needles on them, and the trunks hadn't been burned. There was a stripe or maybe a patch of burned grass. It went from the hole, up the hill, and toward the fires. Once everyone woke up, they saw that no one was hurt too badly. We looked for Casey for 3 or 4 hours, but we couldn't find him. I don't know what we all saw, but we did. Hello, Donovan. I'm glad to be able to send this to you. I've tried to talk about it before, but it felt too strange. I'm from Colorado. I was born here and grew up mostly in the Denver area. I never felt at home in the city, so when I graduated from college, I moved to the mountains. I got my civil engineering degree at CU Boulder. People think that Boulder has a lot of hippies, but I was never one of them. I liked living there, but when everyone was partying on the weekends, I would take my tent and head for the hills. I learned about some good places that are out of the way. So I've gotten used to the animals that live in the mountains. I see a lot of deer and elk. You won't be bothered by the coyotes? They can make people feel scared. But for me, it's nice to hear them at night. I had a scary experience with a mountain lion once. I was coming back from a hike as the sun was setting, and all of a sudden, there it was in front of me on the trail. The right thing to do is to make noise and look big and tough, then slowly move away. Even though I was really scared, I was able to remember those things. It looked at me for a long time, but then it made a noise like snuffling and walked away. Like I wasn't important enough to say all that about. I'm used to seeing the animals that live there come and go. We managed to coexist just fine. After I finished my degree, I was hired to work on the old Moffat Tunnel. It's a railroad and water tunnel that cuts through the Continental Divide in north-central Colorado. So it's pretty high up there, almost 10,000 feet above sea level. It was given a National Historic Civil Engineering Landmark designation. So I was honored to have a chance to work with it. I signed a deal to work on the restoration for 18 months. I stayed in an old cabin up there. At the end of the day, everyone else would rather go back down. So I was mostly alone. It was great to work hard during the day and then have a peaceful night under a sky full of stars. It's not for everyone, but I loved it on the weekends, even though a lot of crazy kids would party there. They were drawn to the tunnel in some way. It's 24 feet tall, 18 feet wide, and 6 miles long. After I'd been up there for 4 or 5 months, you can imagine how many crazy people got on their R15 trains every day. The bodies started to show up near where the tunnel opened. At first, I thought that these things were getting hit by trains, but when I got a closer look, it was clear that they had been eaten because there were only a few pieces left. There are way too many of them for them all to have been killed by wild animals. I kept picking up the piles of fur and bone and burying them as best I could. After that first mountain lion, I never saw another bear or any other animals. For some reason, college students liked to come to that area to take acid trips. It was really exciting for them to get high and watch the train go by. I was afraid that one of them would go too far and do something dumb. As a doctor, I sure wasn't ready for full-grown teenagers. When they got home in the late afternoon, they pretended to be Robin Hood and his merry men and walked around the woods. I'm not kidding you. That's what they agreed to. When it got dark enough, they would get close to the tunnel and wait. It seems that the lights and sounds of the trains really did take them to another place. For hours, they'd be gasping, laughing, howling, and dancing. I don't know how you were able to be so sad for so long. I've never tried it. One night, I went to bed at midnight in my cabin. I could still hear them riding around outside, but I was almost asleep. Then I heard a lot of yelling. I thought at first that it was all part of the crazy. But no, this was a scream that made your blood boil. I got out of bed quickly, put on my pants, and ran out there. They were all yelling and running away from each other. So much darkness. I didn't know why, but I smelled something strong that reminded me of skunk. I'm wondering if they have something to smoke out there. Then I heard a train coming toward us through the tunnel. When the light came in, I could see the shape of a big, hairy animal. It was wonderful. Like 9 foot tall. The tunnel was 24 feet long, and this thing almost got to the middle. It was angry and making a lot of noise because of that group of kids. I think they all made it back to their cars even though they were all over the place. The train roared by and made it impossible to see that animal. I ran to the cabin and shut the door behind me. It was impossible for something to be that big. Have you heard of anything similar happening here in Colorado? It was like something out of Bigfoot. I thought most of them lived in Oregon. Afterwards, I started going back to town with the other workers to sleep at night. I thought that was a little too much. Let me know what you think of these submissions in the comments below, and if you like my stories, you might want to hit that subscribe button.